right, today we're back talking all about drum bus compression. Now, in part one, in the last video, we did a bunch of ear training, trying to get us used to hearing the compressor and how it's working and what it's doing, and especially how the different controls relate to one another and the interplay between the controls. And in doing that, we explored different ways to get punchy, snappy drum bus compression, and we also looked at how to get fatness and kind of a beefy, weighty drum bus compression. So what we're going to do today is just apply standard compression, which is a nice blend of both of those, but nothing over the top. We're just adding a couple dB of gain reduction, gluing everything together, increasing the snap and the punch, and getting a little bit of extra weight and body to the drums. And in doing that, we are going to talk about a couple different approaches to getting a standard drum bus compression. One where we only engage the threshold a little bit below the transient peaks, and one where we engage it quite a bit further into the decay and the sustain. And we're going to talk about how you adjust your attack and release and ratio depending on the method, because it's really two different sounds, and it kind of just depends on what you want for your drums and your song. So let's dive right in and start turning some knobs and making some moves. Right, and we're starting with the vocals all muted here. The drum bus is over here in purple, and we do have a kick bus and a snare bus. The toms and cymbals, hi-hats, everything are going to this main drum bus. And there's nothing on here right now except this compressor, but we haven't engaged the threshold yet. So we don't have a super dynamic drum bus here, which is nice. And that means we can take a little bit more of a modest approach to our drum bus compression and really focus on the feel and the groove that we're after. So the standard way that you think about applying drum bus compression is to just engage the peaks of the transients till you get a couple healthy dB of gain reduction. And like I covered in the last video, this free loudness meter called Ulean, the loudness range right here, the third one down, this tells you the volume difference between your peaks and your average. And right now we're running at around 19, 18. So that's really helpful. If it's in the high 20s or into the 30s, then your drum kit is really, really dynamic, and it's going to be harder to get drum bus compression the way you want. And the way to get it down to a range like this is to apply a little bit of compression or limiting or especially clipping on the kick and the snare and maybe the toms before they get to your drum bus. That makes your compression job way easier. And we're using Molotok again. This is the free compressor by Tokyo Dawn. This compressor is fantastic. So now we've engaged like 3-4 dB of gain reduction. And for bus compression, you want this knob here set in the middle. This is the beta mode, which is better for drum bus compression. And this is like your peak versus RMS detection, and this really changes the way the attack behaves. And the rest of these settings are at default right now. Now, if we're just going to go with this first approach where you just engage the peaks a little bit, and we have a healthy ratio of about 4-to-1, then you might get away with more like 6-to-1 if you're just engaging the peaks. And then you're going to adjust your attack to see how much transient you want let through. And again, that's something that's really helpful to do at a low listening volume. So I'm going to start with the attack way too fast. We're going to cut off most of the transient. I'm going to leave the release at 100 milliseconds. Turn the volume way down and turn the mix on, and then we're going to back off on the attack until we hear the amount of transient coming through the mix that we like. Add a little makeup gain. So that's a pretty fast attack right there. That's just under 5 milliseconds. Let's let a little more transient through. Back it off a little bit. And I'm going to turn my listening volume back up. And bypass. So that adds a nice snap and punch to it. Now let's slow the release down and get a little bit more of the weighty beefiness to the back end. And as we slow the release down, listen to the kick drum and the snare drum. Listen to how long they resonate and ring out, and kind of the roominess and boxiness quality of them. And listen to that kind of increase. So there's a little more sustain on the snare drum right now. And it does change the weight and feel of the kick drum with this slower release. Let's compare that to a fast release. Back to a slow. And bypass. So right there, that's been pretty easy to just dial in a little bit of extra snap and punch, and the slower release is giving them some weight and a little bit of extra groove and bounce to the drums, but they're nice and glued together. See, here with the bypassed, the kick and the snare and the hi-hat and the toms all sound a little separate from each other. But with the compressor on, they're kind of all glued together like one instrument. So that's the glue factor that we want. And we did that with the ratio of 6:1, and the attack right now is just under 7 milliseconds, but this is all really relative to your drums. So this is a basic drum bus compression. We've added the snap and punch and increased the beef and the weight a little bit, and this is nice. We could run with this. Now, if we were to engage the threshold a little further, it's going to dramatically change the attack and the transient, and it's also going to clamp down further into the rest of the signal where that decay and sustain is. Let's dig the threshold way down into the signal now. Okay, and now we're going to back off on our ratio. And now if I turn my listening volume back down and focus just on the attack, I'm going to bury the attack super fast again, and then we're going to slowly back off on it. And to get a similar amount of punch and snap from our attack setting, it's going to be different now that the threshold is engaged further. With the threshold engaged that far, since our drums are not super dynamic, I don't need that heavy of a ratio. That'll just be over compressing, and it probably won't sound very good. So I'm just now at 2.7 on the ratio, so pretty gentle. So now let's back off on the attack and listen to the transient of the drums cut through the mix until we find a spot that we kind of like. And I'm going to turn my listening volume back up. And bypass. So to me, that's even snappier and punchier with the threshold buried as far as the transients are concerned. And we have a slower attack. It's now at 20 milliseconds, which is still pretty fast, but it's slower than when the threshold wasn't engaged as far. And now let's slow the release down again and listen to the tail end of the drums and the boxiness and weightiness of it, and find a setting that we like that makes them sound a little fatter. And here you can see that with the threshold engaged further, the same release settings no longer apply, because a slow release is kind of relative to how far the threshold is engaged. Okay, let's try it with a faster release. And compare that to a slower release. So with a threshold setting like this, the slower release is actually creating a little distortion and compromising our drum sound. So the more you engage the threshold down into the decay and sustain part of the waveform, the less you use the release to gain that fatness, because the threshold's kind of doing it for you. And bypass. I'm going to slow the attack down a little more, actually, let a little more transient through, and see if we can get it just a little more snappy. And speed the release up a hair to give it a little more punch. So with a setting like this is more of a slow to medium attack and a faster release. Because we've dug the threshold so far into the ADSR, the compressor is really engaging the decay and sustain of the drums. And with the threshold engaged like this, you won't need as fast of an attack for a good snap and punch, and you won't need as slow of a release for a good weightiness and beefiness on the tail end. And that part is really important. When the threshold is engaged this far, the release becomes a lot more powerful and even finicky. So you have to listen for distortion that you might be causing on your low end and in your high end, but also those slow release times that added the fatness before, those are going to be much faster now with the threshold engaged this far. And back here with the slow release, we are hearing a little bit of distortion in the cymbals and on the tail end of the snare and even the kick drum. And we'll compare that to the faster release. This right here is a nice standard compression, but just with the different method. Again, the first method, we were just engaging kind of the peaks of the ADSR. Now we're engaging way down into the decay and sustain, which calls for backing off on the ratio and a slower attack and a faster release. Now let's turn the vocals back on and hear this in the full mix.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between them eyes. Well, I'd rather go blind than see you win. Yes, I'd rather die trying than to let you live. Get your game on. Bring it on, bring it on.
Yeah, that's really nice. So that's two different approaches there, and it's still a happy medium of both. We're still getting a little bit of extra punch, and we're also getting a little bit of extra beefiness and weightiness and body to the drums, and it's still all nice and glued together. And knowing the two different approaches, which really center around how much you bury the threshold into the signal and then adjust the attack and release and ratio accordingly, is really two different sounds. You're just going for a couple dB of gain reduction, some nice glue, enhancing the groove, and not overdoing it. Now, let's take out a hair more transient and tighten this up a little bit, which will push the drums a little further into the background. Back off on the release just a hair. That might be sounding a little more natural there. Now, if I back off on the threshold just a touch and increase the ratio a touch, that should also make it sound a little less processed and a little more natural. Bypass. Yeah, definitely punchier and snappier, but the drums also have more weight to them on the decay and sustain side of the signal. But there you go, and it really depends on how much you want to drag that threshold down into the signal. Listen for your attack and transient and how much you want to let through, and it helps to do that at a lower listening volume. And then when you're adjusting the release, you're going to be listening for how much weight and beefiness and fatness is on the tail end of the drums. But yeah, two different approaches with two different outcomes. That's two totally different styles of compression, and neither one is right or wrong. It's just nice to know how to dial in both, because different songs call for different drum bus compression. At the end of the day, I like this one. I think that sounds pretty good. And then in the next video, we'll set up some parallel drum bus tracks, and we're gonna really compress one to accent the punch. And we'll do the same thing with the decay and sustain side of the signal. We're gonna really beef up and fatten up the sustain. We'll blend in a little bit of that in parallel. So parallel drum bus compression's coming up next. But don't forget, if your drums are too dynamic, make sure you revisit your snare and your kick and maybe your toms and add some clipping and limiting and a little bit of peak reduction on those before they get to your drum bus. That'll make it a lot easier to dial in a nice sounding drum bus compression. But there you go. Hope you like that. Let me know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to check out the Patreon. We're doing a mix contest over there this August, and it's not too late to jump in. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got several hours worth of great Q&A over there, and you'll be supporting the channel. It's only $5 a month, and there's a lot of great information, and you can join the conversation over there. But all right, you guys, happy mixing. Catch you on the next one.